Ava kept both hands flat on the conference table because she could feel the tremor in her fingers, and she refused to let Lorraine see it. Harbour Community Bank had given them the smallest room on the fourth floor, no windows, one camera in the corner, one speakerphone in the middle, and a pitcher of water no one touched. Lorraine sat beside her in a wool coat she never removed indoors, posture perfect, expression almost bored, as if late fees, tenant complaints, and foreclosure notices were all small inconveniences invented by lesser people. Denise Wu from Special Assets flipped through a folder with color tabs, and Mateo Cruz stood near the door with his inspection binder tucked against his chest, waiting to be asked for facts instead of opinions. George was there too, 2 chairs away from Ava, plain navy work jacket, old boots still marked with dried plaster. Lorraine had spent the first 10 minutes referring to him as the plumber, and Ava had pretended not to notice the way Denise looked up each time. Denise set one document in front of Lorraine, another in front of Ava, and finally one in front of George. She did not raise her voice when she spoke, and the room shifted anyway. For the record, Mr. Anderson is managing partner of Hawthorne Infrastructure Holdings. Ava felt her lungs miss a beat, and in that half-second, every midnight conversation in the basement, every clipped technical answer, every silence from him when Lorraine spoke down to him, all came back in a different order. Lorraine turned toward George so quickly her chair legs scraped. George did not look at Lorraine. He looked at Ava once, like he was giving her time to stand on new ground before anyone asked her to walk. 8 weeks earlier, Ava's world had been narrow enough to memorize by sound. The boiler clicked at 5:40 each morning if the pilot held. Mrs. Patel in 1A opened her door at 6:15 for newspaper pickup and coughed twice before heading back in. The second-floor hallway radiator hissed for 12 seconds and knocked once before settling. Lorraine came down from the owner's unit at 7:30 in heeled shoes and always stopped outside Ava's door first, not to knock, only to check whether Ava had already left to deal with someone else's problem. 18. Hawthorne Row held 6 apartments pressed into an old brick shell that used to be proud and now was simply tired. Ava lived in the rear room off the laundry alcove and paid Lorraine $950 every month for that privilege. Cash in an envelope, receipt only when she asked twice. She had moved in 3 years earlier after her mother died, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself family could still mean shelter. Lorraine had called it a practical arrangement from day one. Ava handled tenant calls, collected rent when people were late, sat for maintenance visits Lorraine never wanted to schedule, and made excuses no one believed when repairs were postponed again. In return, she had a roof, a room, and the kind of dependence that came wrapped in favors. She did not call herself building administrator because Lorraine had never put that title in writing. Yet everyone who lived there called Ava first when anything failed. She answered because she could not stand hearing panic through a wall and doing nothing. The call that changed everything came from Unit 3B at 12:17 a.m. on a cold October night. Ava woke to pounding on her door and the sound of water where water should never be, a rushing inside the walls that made her sit up before she was fully conscious. She opened to find Theo from 3B barefoot in the hall, sleeves soaked, saying ceiling, ceiling like a prayer and a warning at once. By the time she reached the second-floor landing, water was already pouring through a light fixture and running down the stair rail in clear sheets. She shouted for everyone to kill power at the breaker strips, grabbed the emergency contact list off the bulletin board, and called the first plumber Lorraine approved for after-hours work. Lorraine did not answer Ava's first call or the second, and on the third, she picked up long enough to say, "Handle it and keep receipts," before hanging up. Ava heard a child crying through apartment 2A and went there first. Carried 2 laundry baskets into the hallway to catch the worst of the leak. Sent Theo downstairs to move boxes away from shared walls, and called again until the emergency service confirmed dispatch. She was standing ankle-deep in cold water near the basement stair when headlights cut across the frosted front window. George stepped in with a hard case in one hand and a coil of hose over his shoulder, looked up once at the ceiling stain patterns, then asked 3 questions in quick sequence. Where was the main shutoff? Which unit stack fed 3B, and had anyone touched the old brass valves on the east riser in the past year? Ava blinked because no plumber had asked her that 3rd question before. She told him what she knew, which was almost nothing, except that Lorraine deferred every replacement unless an inspector had already written it down. George nodded once and said, "Show me the shutoff." His voice was quiet enough that people leaned in to hear him. In the basement, he moved with an economy Ava noticed immediately. No wasted motions, no theatrical cursing, no performance of urgency. He mapped the line by touch and listened with a mechanic's stethoscope against old copper, then closed one gate valve and opened another to relieve pressure through a drain point that looked unused for years. The roar in the walls dropped to a high hiss within seconds. Upstairs, the flow thinned to drips. He asked for 2 clean towels, 1 bucket and a stepladder, then disappeared into 3B with Theo, while Ava directed everyone else into dry rooms and started inventorying damage by apartment. When George came back down 40 minutes later, his sleeves were wet to the elbows, and there was drywall dust in his hair. "Pinhole failure plus cracked fitting," he said. "Temporary stabilization is in. Permanent replacement needs copper and valves in daylight." Ava asked what she owed for emergency labor because Lorraine's voice was still in her ear. He handed her a carbon copy invoice with $480 written beside labor and call-out, then itemized projected replacement copper and valves at $320. Total expected, $800. Ava looked at the numbers and felt the old calculations start. Rent due in 11 days. Groceries transit card. Mrs. Patel's prescription pickup she had already promised to front because insurance reimbursement was late. She told George she could pay part now and the rest after Lorraine reimbursed, even while knowing Lorraine never reimbursed quickly unless someone threatened court. He said he could return in the morning for permanent repair only if materials were approved tonight. She stared at the basement floor, at water creeping toward a box of tenant mail, and reached for her wallet. She counted out $600 from her personal savings envelope, cash she had set aside over months for an eventual security deposit somewhere else, somewhere with a lease and a lock on the inside of the bedroom door. George watched her count, then looked up and asked, "You live here too?" She said yes. He wrote paid $600 on the invoice, left balance $200, and tucked the copy into a plastic sleeve before handing it back. "Keep this dry," he said. "You may need it later." At 2:10 a.m., she made rounds through all 6 apartments, checking outlets and baseboards, promising she would push Lorraine for mold treatment before anyone got blamed for staining walls they did not stain. Mrs. Patel in 1A stood wrapped in a shawl and refused to go back to bed because her unit heater had failed earlier in the evening. Ava told her to take the portable heater from Ava's own room, carried it across the hall, and plugged it near Mrs. Patel's reading chair. She spent the rest of the night in 2 sweaters with no heat in her own space, sitting upright on the edge of her mattress because if she lay down, she might sleep through the next leak. By morning, Lorraine finally appeared in the lobby and inspected the wet floors as if reviewing poor housekeeping. She read the invoice, paused at the line where Ava had written, paid $600, and asked why Ava had made unauthorized financial decisions. Ava explained that emergency replacement required immediate materials approval to prevent repeat flooding. Lorraine tapped the paper against her palm and said, "You are not owner, manager, or decision-maker, Ava. You are family and tenant. Try to remember the order." She slid the invoice into her handbag without returning Ava's copy until Ava asked twice. Tenants watched from half-open doors, and Ava kept her face neutral because she had learned the cost of public reaction in Lorraine's building. George returned that afternoon with copper lengths, 2 full-port brass valves, and a carton of compression fittings. Mateo Cruz, city plumbing inspector for their district, arrived separately for a scheduled check next door and stepped in after hearing about the overnight incident. He watched George's repair for 10 minutes and asked where he had learned to isolate pressure through that old east riser without blowing weak joints in adjacent units. George gave a short answer about line history and load tolerances. Mateo looked at him for a second longer than casual, then turned to Ava and requested maintenance logs for the last 18 months. Ava did not have formal logs because Lorraine never kept formal logs. She had her notebooks, pocket calendars filled with dates and handwritten notes like 2B leak repeat and 1A heater fail, plus phone screenshots of unanswered repair messages. Mateo accepted copies and said quietly, "Patterns matter in code cases." Lorraine entered mid-conversation and smiled in a way that looked generous from a distance. "Inspector, whatever Ava gave you is informal," she said. "She likes lists." Mateo replied, "Informal records can still establish notice." And Lorraine's smile thinned at the edges. 2 days after that repair, Mateo returned without announcing it to ownership and ran an independent code review on the east riser and connected lines, using Ava's dates to choose test points Lorraine had never flagged. He compared pressure behavior across units, checked prior patch locations, and logged owner-notified defects that had no documented completion. The review resolved his hesitation from that first question in the basement, and once he saw George's precision reflected in the system data, he opened a formal pattern file under his own authority instead of relying on owner-submitted summaries. The week that followed tightened around Ava in small ways. Lorraine delayed reimbursement for the $600 and deducted administrative errors from Ava's next grocery reimbursement request. The savings envelope Ava had emptied that night never recovered, and each morning she had to choose which expense could wait so rent would still be on time. Lorraine instructed tenants to submit all complaints directly to ownership, then left town for 2 days without forwarding calls. Ava still answered every knock because people lived there and pipes did not respect chain of command. George came back twice for follow-up checks, once to monitor pressure after the new valve settled, and once to inspect a related corrosion point under 2A. Each visit was brief, technical, almost impersonal, and still Ava found herself listening for his truck at dusk. On his third return visit, he stood in the hallway outside 3B and looked at the patched ceiling while Ava held a flashlight. "This stain edge is older than last week," he said. "Someone painted over water damage before." Ava laughed once without humor. That could describe half this building. He asked if she had ever signed for owner-directed deferrals. She said Lorraine handled official forms and kept records private. He nodded and said, "Keep your copies of everything from now on." He said it like practical advice. Nothing more, yet she heard urgency in it. By late October, the building had developed a rhythm of constrained proximity. George came when called, worked fast, and left receipts with exact timestamps. Ava met him in basements, hallways, and stairwells, where old plaster smelled damp even on dry days. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was specific, usually after she answered a technical question clearly instead of pretending certainty. He learned tenants' names without using them often. Mrs. Patel started calling him The Midnight Gentleman, which made him blink as if the title embarrassed him. Lorraine's contempt, once subtle, became active. She began correcting Ava in front of tenants for minor details she had approved privately, and once she told Theo, within Ava's hearing, "Some people confuse availability with authority." Ava kept doing laundry room lock checks, package logs, and nightly thermostat rounds because if she stopped, tenants would absorb the consequence first. She asked again about reimbursement for the $600, and Lorraine said, "Family does not invoice family." The phrase landed with polished cruelty, designed to sound principled while denying debt. Ava folded the receipt and placed it in a plastic document sleeve under her mattress. During that same week, Lorraine started taking long phone calls behind her office door, voice low, latch clicked shut even in the middle of ordinary afternoons. If Ava crossed the hall, the voice dropped further, then resumed when footsteps passed. The pattern changed the air in the house long before Ava knew the content, and she began noting call dates in her pocket calendar, alongside leak reports because secrecy had become another maintenance issue she might need to prove. A week later, she heard the sentence that ended any remaining illusion she could wait this out quietly. It happened on a Tuesday around 9:40 p.m. when Lorraine thought Ava had gone to the corner pharmacy. Ava had forgotten her umbrella, returned through the side entry, and paused at the kitchen because Lorraine was on speakerphone in the next room with the door mostly closed. Ava should have stepped away, and she would have, except she heard her own name with the tone Lorraine used when arranging outcomes. "File the violations in her lane," Lorraine said. "She has been acting as manager without title anyway. If the city needs a name, give them hers first, and serve her notice once the hearing date is set." Ava stood still until her calf muscles burned. She did not breathe deeply, because sound carried in old houses. Lorraine continued, talking about occupancy pressure, insurance leverage, and cleaning the building narrative, before refinancing discussions resumed. Ava backed away one step at a time, opened the side door without letting the hinge click, and walked to the pharmacy in steady weather she no longer felt. She bought toothpaste. She did not need to justify the trip if asked, then stood in aisle 4 under fluorescent lights and read the same label 3 times while her throat worked against tears she would not shed where anyone could see. The next morning she functioned as usual, and that frightened her more than panic would have. She emptied lint traps, posted a hot water outage notice for Unit 2B, and called the pest service Lorraine had postponed twice. She avoided being alone with Lorraine long enough to think clearly. Once she had the thought in full, she wrote it in her notebook exactly as she needed to remember it. If she stayed silent, Lorraine would put legal liability in her name and remove her from the building anyway. The hesitation that had held Ava in place for years, fear of losing shelter if she challenged family control, no longer protected her because shelter was already being prepared as a weapon. That afternoon, she called Matteo from the payphone near the laundromat because Lorraine monitored the shared Wi-Fi call logs. Matteo met her outside city offices and listened without interrupting while she described the overheard conversation and handed over copies of repair notes, invoice scans, and a list of deferred issues by unit. He did not offer comfort language. He said, "If owner-directed deferral is documented, violation liability can shift to owner. I need dates and duplicates." Ava told him she had duplicates of some records and could create sworn statements for the rest. Matteo said he would expand the independent code review, already opened after the East Riser repair, and asked whether tenants would attest to maintenance requests submitted directly to Lorraine. Ava nodded and named all 6 residents, including herself. George arrived that evening for a scheduled follow-up on the 3B line and found Ava in the basement sorting papers into labelled envelopes. He glanced at the stack and asked, "You filing?" She said yes. He looked at her for a long second, then set down his tool bag and pulled a small camera from his jacket pocket. I photograph every owner-directed deferral I'm told to leave unresolved, he said. Date stamped, location tagged. I can provide copies if subpoenaed. Ava stared at him, hearing the implication. He had been documenting all along, not as gossip, as evidence. Why? She asked. He tightened a fitting before answering. Because pipes fail on schedule, and people lie on demand. The days moved faster once formal processes began. Matteo posted preliminary notices on common boards, citing code review pending and requiring owner response within statutory timelines. Lorraine exploded in private and performed composure in public, insisting Ava had become confused by attention. She tried to cut Ava's access to storage and maintenance keys, which only meant tenants had to request entries directly, and started noticing how often Lorraine failed to answer. Mrs. Patel knocked on each door over 2 evenings and asked people to sign a statement if Ava had responded when ownership did not. All 6 signed. 6 of 6. Mrs. Patel carried the petition to Ava in a grocery bag and said, "You gave me your heater when you were cold. People remember who keeps them safe." Ava took the petition with both hands. She read each signature twice because she had spent so long believing she stood alone that visible proof felt unreal. Lorraine saw the papers on the table later that night and laughed softly. "Tenant theatrics," she said. "No court replaces ownership because residents prefer your smile." Ava did not answer. She filed the petition behind the invoice in her document sleeve, and the next morning she delivered copies to Matteo's office, keeping one sealed duplicate with a date stamp. George's presence remained measured and practical, even as pressure increased. He never asked Ava for personal confession and never offered dramatic promises. He solved what he could, documented what he could not solve without owner approval, and taught Ava how to read pressure gauge behavior so she could detect recurring failures before tenants lost heat. In one hallway conversation, he noticed her shivering and asked where her space heater was. She said she had loaned it weeks earlier to Mrs. Patel and did not mention that Lorraine still had not replaced it, partly because the unreimbursed $600 had already stripped her margin thin, and another purchase would push rent risk onto next month. He looked down the corridor toward 1A, then back at Ava, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly, a decision settling in behind his eyes. The next day, a new heater arrived for Ava's room with no card and no invoice attached. She knew immediately where it came from and called George to ask what she owed. He said, "It came from overstock after a cancelled job." She said she did not want favors. He replied, "Then call it equipment continuity for on-site response," and ended the call before she could argue. She smiled despite herself, first real smile in days, then went upstairs to reset a tripped breaker in 2 amps, because life kept moving even when her chest felt newly light. By mid-November, Harbor Community Bank filed formal foreclosure action based on arrears of $38,400 tied to Lorraine's 2025 refinance on 18 Hawthorne Row. The number entered Ava's life like a weather system she could not outrun. Lorraine responded with polished indignation and told tenants there would be temporary paperwork noise. Denise Wu from Special Assets notified all interested parties of a December workout conference, including owner, occupancy representative, municipal compliance observer, and prospective managing participants. Lorraine scoffed at the wording and told Ava she could attend only as family witness, with no speaking rights unless asked. Ava arrived at the bank with one messenger bag containing everything she had: emergency invoice showing $480 labor and projected $320 materials. Note that she paid $600 from personal savings at 12:17 a.m. incident response. Copies of maintenance requests. Dated photographs from George's records now released through proper channels. Mateo's independent pattern review findings on owner-directed deferral, and the tenant petition, signed 6 of 6. She had slept 3 hours and eaten half a banana in the bus station. She still sat straight when the conference started because posture had become a form of control she could afford. Lorraine opened with a statement about rogue maintenance narratives and framed Ava's actions as emotional overreach by a dependent relative. Denise listened and asked for documentary support. Lorraine produced a binder with selective receipts and no acknowledgement of repeated tenant notices. Mateo presented municipal records of deferred repairs tied to owner notification dates, plus his independent code review notes from the East Riser sequence that had triggered the file. Lorraine attempted to classify Ava as unauthorized manager responsible for code failures. Mateo answered with one sentence that stripped strategy from performance. Records show owner-directed deferral after notice, and liability follows decision authority. Ava felt the room tilt toward fact and away from hierarchy for the first time in years. She expected George to remain a technical witness, maybe confirm line failures, maybe identify repair timelines. He had spoken fewer than 20 words by then. Denise asked whether any party could present a credible supervised management transition plan that protected occupancy and completed compliance within financing constraints. Lorraine started to object, and that was when Denise delivered the sentence that reordered everything. For the record, Mr. Anderson is managing partner of Hawthorne Infrastructure Holdings. No raised tone, no spectacle, just a fact placed exactly where denial could not reach it. Ava did not trust her own voice immediately, so she kept her eyes on the table until breathing steadied. George opened a folder and slid a draft term sheet toward Denise and Mateo first, then toward Ava. It outlined a supervised purchase plan for 18 Hawthorne Row at $410,000, staged transfer structure, compliance milestones, and tenant protection clauses that preserved occupancy during repairs. Funding included a down payment line of $41,000 from a silent concessionary note provided through George's holding entity, structured to give Ava operational control while title transfer phased under court oversight. Lorraine read the first page and said, "This is collusion," with less confidence than accusation required. Denise asked if Lorraine had a competing cure proposal for arrears, code compliance, and occupancy continuity. Lorraine offered no numbers, only objections to process and insults to motive. Mateo placed the tenant petition on the table and asked that it be entered as supporting evidence for operational reliability. Mrs. Patel, invited as resident witness, spoke in calm, measured tones about the flood night and the heater Ava carried into 1A after spending her own savings on the emergency repair. She said plainly, "She gave me her heater and sat in the cold herself. She answered when we called." She did not embellish. She named dates. She named who answered calls and who did not. Lorraine tried to interrupt twice and was warned by Denise to allow witness completion. Denise then marked exhibit copies from George's date-stamped photo log and deferred work records, and once those were entered, Lorraine's claim that Ava had acted alone in repair decisions no longer held its shape. Once the meeting ended, Ava waited in the hallway by a vending machine that sold stale crackers and warm soda. George approached without hurry, carrying his jacket over one arm. She asked, "How long have you been watching this building?" He answered, "Since before the flood call, on and off, after a referral about distressed infrastructure." She nodded, processing each word like an object with edges. "MIT?" she asked, uncertain why that detail mattered first. Mechanical engineering, 2012, he said. Journeyman plumber license in Massachusetts, 2014. Family route. Different tracks, same systems. She asked why he left infrastructure finance if he had that path. He looked past her at nothing for a moment and said, "Procurement dispute in 2021. Non-criminal, loud enough that silence became useful." He met her eyes again. "I still do the work. I choose where." She absorbed the answer without asking for narrative polish. She had no appetite for polished anything. She asked one final question that mattered now. Was any of this a test? George took time before answering, which she recognized as respect. "I already knew the building numbers," he said. "I did not know who would protect people when no one was watching." He did not reach for her hand. He stood beside her in shared quiet until Denise called them back, for signatures on interim stipulations. January 2027 arrived with hard wind and legal paperwork, thick enough to feel like construction material. Court-approved settlement terms voided Lorraine's operational control at 18 Hawthorne Row, based on documented owner-directed deferral, arrears failure, and misrepresentation attempts regarding liability assignment. Management rights transferred immediately to Ava under supervised purchase plan terms, while title transfer remained staged against compliance milestones and financing release conditions. Lorraine retained no authority to collect rent, issue notices, or direct maintenance. She contested once, briefly, then withdrew after counsel reviewed the evidence chain, including Matteo's independent review and George's date-stamped documentation, and found no breakpoints to challenge. When the order was served, Lorraine stood in the lobby with her coat on and keys in hand, as if delay could reverse language already filed. Ava waited beside Matteo while the process server read the operative sections. Lorraine looked at Ava and said, "You think this makes you owner overnight?" Ava replied, "It makes residents safe today," and held out a receipt book for key transfer inventory. Lorraine dropped the keys into Ava's palm one ring at a time. Each metal click sounded small and final. Operational life after settlement was not cinematic, and that gave Ava relief. She spent mornings scheduling licensed crews in legal order, plumbing first, electrical second, mold remediation third, with unit access windows posted 48 hours in advance. Afternoons went to paperwork, rent ledgers, bank compliance calls, and resident check-ins. Evenings she walked every floor and wrote tomorrow's list. George attended weekly planning meetings in plain clothes and spoke in short, practical sentences, never claiming credit, never performing authority he did not need to perform. When contractors tried to bypass Ava and pitch terms to him directly, he redirected with one line: "Operational decisions go through Ms. Sullivan." The $41,000 concessionary note from George's entity sat in the financing stack as promised, silent and binding. Not a gift, not leverage, a structural bridge that made the down payment viable without trapping Ava in private debt she could not negotiate. Denise supervised disbursement timing through Harbor's special assets framework and treated Ava with the same professional precision she offered everyone else, which Ava appreciated more than sympathy. Numbers aligned for the first time. The purchase price remained $410,000. Milestones were explicit. Every completed repair moved title transfer one step forward. Matteo's final compliance walkthrough in early spring took nearly 4 hours. He checked pressure consistency across all 6 apartments, verified valve replacements, reviewed heater installations, and cross-referenced permit closures against field conditions. He asked Mrs. Patel whether response times had improved. She said, "Now, when we call, someone answers with a plan and a time." Matteo signed the compliance confirmation and handed a copy to Ava, then another to Denise. He nodded toward George and said, with dry humor, "Midnight calls got expensive for the city to ignore." George's smile appeared briefly, rare and genuine. Ava used her first fully authorized budget month to reimburse herself the $600 she had paid on flood night, documenting it as delayed emergency outlay recovery approved under settlement accounting rules. She sat at her desk after entering the line item and stared at the ledger for a long time, not because of the amount, but because this was the first time the system acknowledged what she had carried alone. She printed the page and filed it behind the original invoice copy with $480 labor, $320 materials, and paid $600 written in her own midnight handwriting. Residents adjusted to the new order in gradual ways. Theo from 3B stopped keeping storage boxes on pallets because he trusted the ceiling now. The child in 2A slept through storms without crying in the hallway. Mrs. Patel returned Ava's old portable heater with a note taped to it that read, "Keep this for someone else next winter." Ava left the note in the office drawer where she kept forms requiring signatures, a reminder that documentation could also hold kindness, not only risk. 6 apartments, 6 doors, 6 sets of routines that now leaned toward stability instead of dread. George remained cautious with public identity. Some contractors recognized his name from infrastructure circles and tested whether gossip could extract details about 2021. He gave none. Ava learned the outline from records and one conversation, enough to understand that a non-criminal procurement dispute had ended one version of his career without ending his competence. She did not press for more, and he seemed grateful for restraint. Their closeness grew through work habits first, then through trust that had survived unequal information without turning manipulative. He still arrived early, still noticed what others dismissed, and now he asked before fixing anything in her office because control mattered differently when it finally belonged to her. One evening after tenant hours, Ava and George stood on the front steps watching rain bead on new gutter seams. Traffic on Hawthorne moved slow under wet streetlights. Ava said she had spent years believing dignity meant enduring quietly until conditions changed on their own. George said endurance had kept people alive in that building, and action had changed who held authority. She looked toward the lobby window where her name now appeared on the posted management notice, typed cleanly, no asterisk, no family qualifier. "I still feel like I'm waiting for someone to take this back," she admitted. George answered, "That reflex fades when facts keep holding." The final title transfer conference was shorter than the first and almost peaceful. Denise confirmed milestone completion. Matteo confirmed compliance. Financing documents executed under the same terms entered in December and January records, with no hidden amendments. Lorraine was not present. Her counsel had accepted settlement closure and withdrawn all operational claims. Ava signed where indicated, each signature slower than the one before, as if pacing herself through a doorway she had once believed was sealed. George signed as managing partner witness and guarantor on the concessionary structure, then closed his folder and sat back. The first morning after final execution, Ava arrived before sunrise and unlocked 18 Hawthorne Row, with the same key ring Lorraine had dropped into her hand months earlier. The building smelled different now, less damp plaster, more fresh paint and clean metal. She turned on lobby lights, checked overnight temperature logs, and opened her office door to a desk stacked with routine things, delivery slips, one lease renewal, one clogged sink request that could wait until 9. Mrs. Patel passed by with her newspaper and said, "Good morning, Ms. Sullivan," in a tone that held no deference, only recognition. Ava smiled and returned the greeting. George came in carrying a toolbox, not for emergency, Just scheduled maintenance in 2B. He paused at her doorframe and asked, "Anything urgent before I start?" She looked at the day sheet and shook her head. "Nothing urgent," she said, and realized it was true. She watched him walk down the hall and felt the quiet settle around her. Not empty, not lonely. A working quiet earned one invoice, one signature, one refusal to collapse at a time.